Last time, we watched as Sulla tried to return the Republic to a semblance of normalcy, and how badly that project failed. Today, we will examine Sulla's legacy and what it would mean for the Republic for the rest of its existence. Sulla's career began during a period of fractured Republican norms ushered in by Gaius Marius. Therefore, his sense of what was normal and acceptable must necessarily have been different from that of previous generations of Romans. Like Marius, Sulla's career represents a mixture of necessary emergency measures taken purely for the good of the Republic, and other transgressions that are indefensible. In the category of the former, we have Sulla's actions leading up to the First Mithridatic War. Sulla was right to refuse to yield command of his army to Marius for a number of reasons that we covered in the Gaius Marius series. If you haven't heard that one, click here. Furthermore, Sulla's actions in the Mithridatic War were objectively brilliant. His victories in Asia were a net positive for the Roman people. His defeat of Mithridates on the battlefield provided a much-needed deterrent to other great powers out there thinking of challenging Rome militarily. On that note, even Sulla's conduct during his Athenian campaign, while portrayed by the ancient sources as quite negative, can be interpreted in a positive light in the long run. While it is true that Sulla destroyed many ancient treasures by melting them down to pay his personal army, it is also true that we owe the survival of Aristotle's writing to Sulla. That's because it was Sulla who confiscated the library of Apollyon of Teos and transported Aristotle's manuscripts to Rome. From there, the library was copied and compiled by Andronicus of Rhodes. If not for Sulla, it is likely that Aristotle's library would have been lost, as it was in quite a poor condition when he found it. But when it comes to Sulla's conduct in the years after the Mithridatic War, the picture becomes much more grim. Can we really blame him for his march on Rome of 88 BCE? No, not really. Given that Cinna and the other Marians in power had made their intention to hold Sulla criminally liable for taking his army to Asia in the first place, and given that he had declared him a hostis, and had already confiscated all of his property in his absence, how could he have done anything different? But can we blame him for the proscriptions? Yes, I think we can and should. The proscriptions, when taken into account with the casualties of both the Social War and the Mithridatic War, and the previous round of Marian proscriptions, represent the wholesale destruction of at least one generation, but more likely two, of Roman political and military talent that was simply irreplaceable. Put another way, the traditional aristocracy of Rome was already much reduced by the time of Sulla's civil war, and his proscriptions exacerbated an already bad problem. This turn of events is even more unforgivable when you consider that Sulla was supposed to represent the, quote, optimates faction, or the party of the traditional Roman aristocracy. He was the one that wanted to preserve their traditional role in the government and maintain the power of the Senate over the popular assemblies. He did not further any of those goals by killing aristocratic senators. One of the most serious knock-on effects of killing as many aristocrats as he did was the loss of institutional knowledge in the Roman Republic. This loss of knowledge made for a more incompetent government that was more likely to abuse its power and make worse foreign policy decisions. These problems would become more apparent in the generation to follow Sulla. In fact, our ancient sources all agree that the Republic of Marius and Sulla was a very different place than the Republic of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. If respect for the law was eroding in the time of Marius, by the time of Caesar, it was merely an abstract concept that people vaguely understood as a historical virtue. As bad as all of that may have been, it was not as bad as the related topic of Sulla's attempted constitutional reforms. To be clear, it was not the idea of reforming the Republic per se that was the problem. Rather, it was Sulla's methodology and choice of reform. Let's take those two topics in order. Firstly, Sulla's methodology could not have been any worse if he wanted to intentionally damage the fabric of the state. Anyone who has either been a teenager or met one in real life can tell you that the quickest and easiest way to foster resentment in them is through hypocrisy. Yet Sulla chose this very method for virtually every major reform he intended to undertake. He demanded obedience to his arbitrary laws from everyone in the Republic, but then broke the law himself with impunity. A few examples of this sort are his use of the plebiscite to ratify the prescriptions when the Senate had previously rejected them, his public murder of Quintus Ofella, or his march on Rome. All of these actions were roundly illegal, so then why would he assume that anyone would want to obey his laws? Secondly, we have the problem of Sulla's choice of reform. He seemed to think that the problems facing the Republic were judicial in nature, and that new courts and laws governing the tribunate and the cursus honorum would solve everything. But the main problems facing the Republic in the years after the Punic Wars were never about the power of the tribune or holding political office at an inappropriate time. They were about the twin issues of land reform and citizenship, which Sulla's constitutional reforms totally ignored. What might Sulla have done to actually reform the state in a way that would have addressed these intractable issues? To have any hope of answering that question, we must first try to understand what Romans of the time thought about the constitution in general. As it happens, Polybius, a contemporary of Marius and Sulla both, wrote at length about what made the Roman Republic the most perfect constitution devised by man. According to him, the best constitution was a mixture of the three quote-unquote pure constitutions as described by Plato and Aristotle. These pure constitutions were democracy, oligarchy, and monarchy. When a constitution blended all three, it diluted the weaknesses of each and highlighted the strengths, at least according to Polybius. Sulla's reforms mostly affected the Senate, or the oligarchic portion of the Roman constitution. He would have done a much better job of stabilizing the state by strengthening the democratic portion. That's because most of the problems facing the state came from the concilium plebis and the other popular assemblies. If Sulla had granted universal citizenship to all Italian allies, and called for general elections to be held in each major city in allied territory, and then sent those elected to serve in the concilium plebis and the Senate, the system likely would have lasted longer. But the Romans were incapable of reforms of this sort. The institution of the Senate was meant as a bastion of entrenched Roman nobility, and would have been quite hostile to the idea of elections to it. Furthermore, because the Romans organized the popular assemblies by tribe, and because tribal identity was an ancient and important part of what it meant to be a Roman, no statesman would have ever thought to allow non-Roman Italian allies unfettered access to the government in that way. Even the idea of universal citizenship, if someone had suggested it, would have been vehemently opposed by members of the Senate and the faction representing senatorial interests. You know, people like Sulla. Contrary to Sulla's intentions to reform the state, his lasting legacy was the legitimation of political violence and tyranny as solutions to political problems. He proved to his fellow Romans that not only was it possible to take over the state by force, but that it was advantageous to do so. Because Sulla suffered no penalty, but was in fact rewarded mightily for using his army against the state, he set a terrible example for other ambitious generals that might want to do likewise in the future. Sulla's legates, Pompey and Crassus, were watching and learning, as were the young ambitious politicians who, absent Sulla's purges, might not have ever had a chance at the consulship. In fact, many of the political strongmen to emerge in the 70s and 60s will specifically name Sulla as an inspiration for their attempts at ultimate power. We'll call out those instances as we see them in the future. The consensus in the ancient sources indicates that despite his state funeral, nobody was particularly fond of Sulla in the end. This is borne out by the fact that even his close allies fought against his reforms, and they were easily undone. For all of these failures, Sulla certainly deserves a place of pride among the men who killed the Roman Republic. If you agree with my assessment, please leave a comment and a like. If you don't, I especially want to hear from you. This series is a labor of love, and every comment, subscription, and like really does help. I'm Matt Lupu. Thanks for listening.